Welcome back, brothers and sisters. I'm Pam Grove from Preserving Life Ministries, and today we're going to talk about canning essentials. There are essential things that are necessary in order to preserve food safely, and some of these pieces of equipment we have here with us, and we're going to talk about those. But first, we're going to talk about a few facts that we need to know before we go into the kitchen. Most foods require some type of preservation method in order to maintain their freshness and be able to be kept over a long period of time. Understanding how to can prevents the food from deteriorating and causing organisms to grow that would spoil it. Heating the food in sealed jars for a specific period of time and at a set temperature will destroy the heat-resistant bacteria and force air from the jar, creating a seal. The seal, once it forms, prevents bacteria from getting back into the jar and ruining the food. When the food is stored in a dark, cool place between like 50, 70 degrees, it can actually get as high as 90 degrees. It will be kept safe and the color will be fresh and it will last for a long period of time. The ideal temperature for storing food is between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. When you get between 70 and 90 degrees, the food will begin to lose its nutritional value quicker. So if you can keep it in that 50-70 range, you will enjoy your food for a much long period of time. Molds and yeast are the bacteria that we are most concerned about in moist food. Some molds are harmless, but others produce toxins that are harmful to our bodies. Yeast grow best on foods that have a high sugar content or a high acid content, and that causes the food to ferment. Bacteria thrives on non-acid or low-acid foods. Molds and yeast are the main cause of spoilage in high-acid foods like fruits and tomato sauces, preserves, but they are easily destroyed in temperatures of about 212 degrees, which is what a water bath will give you. Bacteria exist in two forms, in a seed form or a spore, or in a vegetative form, something that grows with the crop. They are the chief cause of spoilage in low-acid foods. Therefore, these foods, such as vegetables and most meat products, need to be processed at 240 to 260 degrees Fahrenheit in a pressure canner. It is dangerous to process vegetables or meat in a water bath container because a water bath will only reach 212 degrees, not high enough to kill the spores of botulism. Enzymes are protein molecules in the cells which work as catalysts. They speed up the chemical reactions in the food and in the body, but they don't get used up in the process of that. The enzymatic enzymes or reactions cause the food to change its color. That's what happens when you peel an apple and you leave it out, and the air starts to react with the enzymes in that apple, and the flesh of the apple turns brown. A lot of times we see that is we have a child who bites the apple and decides they don't want it and they put it down. We will see those changes in the food. But enzymes can also cause food spoilage because it goes beyond browning and goes to rotting. And in order to inactivate that, when we are peeling our apples, if we dip them in a little lemon juice before we process them and then process them in a boiling water bath, we will deactivate those enzymes and be able to preserve that food. Now, one thing we need to understand in food preservation is pH. In home canning, there are two classes of pH, high acid and low acid. The most important thing about pH in home canning is the pH determines which canner you're going to use to process your food. If you have a high acid food like tomatoes or fruits or pickled items, you can safely can that in a water bath canner at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. But if your food is low acid, such as vegetables or meat products, you cannot safely can that in a water bath. It has to be put into a pressure canner. The pH of the food is determined by what the food item is. You don't necessarily have to test it with a pH strip, but when you get into mixing your food products, putting more than one vegetable together, the pH will start to change in those food products, and you will need to test, or you will at least need to know the time limits and the weights of pressure that must be used in order to kill the bacteria in that food. If the pH is 4.6 or less, that food is a high acid food. These foods can include heirloom tomatoes, fruits, jellies, and jams, they're all considered high-acid foods. Fermented foods like sauerkraut or brine pickles, those are high-acid foods. The pickles and the sauerkraut are considered high-acid because you add an acid to a vegetable, which brings the pH to a point where the food is high enough to be considered a high-acid food. Vinegar, lemon juice, lime juice, all of those things can be used to acidify foods and bring the pH up. Citric acid, which is a form of vitamin C, can also be used for that means. When we are canning tomatoes, one important thing to consider is the source of the tomato. If you're growing your own tomato, I would suggest that you grow heirloom tomatoes, because with tomato varieties now, there has been a lot of hybridization. And because of the hybrid being a mixture of genes of tomatoes, tomatoes are not anymore considered high acid. Therefore, if you're going to can them and you didn't grow them, they're not heirloom, or you don't know or not sure, it is best to add an acid to the tomato when you can it before you water bath it. Low acid foods have a pH higher than 4.6, and they must be, as I said, processed in a pressure canner. And we talked about vegetables, meats being low acid foods, but did you know that soups, spaghetti sauce, and different sauces of other types, those are all low acid foods. If once you make a soup, the pH changes between the carrot and the tomato and the potato, and once it's all in the pot, the pH goes down. So you must water bath those things. I have another suggestion for you. There are specific guidelines for canning each food product. So if you have carrots in your garden and you want to can those carrots, I would suggest that you not go online and look for a recipe for canning carrots, because those recipes have not been tested. So you don't really know whether or not you should put that in a water bath or put that in a pressure canner, or if you should add acid to it, because it's not tested. The only guidelines that are given to us for recipes that are tested are in the Ball Blue Book of Canning, of Preserving, and the Complete Guide to Home Canning. The recipes for most vegetables that you would want to can will be found in these books. If you do not find them here, you can go on the Ball website or on the USDA website or your local extension office website. Each of these entities give guidelines on canning, recommendations for how to care for your canner, as well as recipes on how to can food. One other thing that you would need to check is your altitude. Anything above 1,000 feet above sea level will need to be, the pressure canning times or the pressure weight will need to be changed accordingly. Barometric pressure is reduced at higher altitudes, and that affects the temperature at which the water will boil. Both boiling water and pressure canner methods have to be adjusted to ensure safety when your altitude is above 1,000 feet. The processing time and the temperatures for the recipes in the Ball Blue Book of Canning and in the USDA guidelines are adjusted for that. If you are processing food in an area that is above 1,000 feet, check your Ball Blue Book, your extension office, or the USDA guidelines for the proper time or the time or temperature that you are to process your food. Now, there's an altitude adjustment chart in the Ball Blue Book. For instance, you are at 3,000 feet because you live in Denver. You would increase, in a water bath canning, you would increase your processing time by 5 minutes. But if you are 10,000 feet above sea level and you're using a pressure canning method, you have to change your weight or the pounds of pressure that you are applying to your food. So at 10,000 feet in Denver, pressure canning some potatoes, I would have to use a 15-pound weight. To hot or cold pack. Hot or cold packing is the method of putting your food in the jar before processing it. And it's a practice of filling the mason jars with freshly prepared food that is either cooked or uncooked. With the cold pack method, the food is still raw, the canning jar is hot, and the water or the syrup that you're going to put in the jar is also hot. You must bring that water or syrup to a boil because that will heat up the surface of the jar before you put it into the canner. The temperature between the jar, the food, and the canner needs to be as consistent as possible, because if not, the jar may fracture in the canner or completely break, and you lose all your hard work in the water of the canner. Hot packing is a process of boiling fresh prepared food first, allowing it to simmer for a few minutes, and then promptly filling the jars with the hot food. The juice or the water must also be brought to a boil, added to that hot jar, and then hot jar added to the hot canner. Hot packing is very advantageous because it removes air. It helps shrink the vegetables or fruits because then you can get more into the jar. And it keeps the food floating, which keeps it moving, which allows the air to escape from the jar. And it helps to create a better seal. This all will improve the shelf life of the food and the amount of food that you can pack in the jar. Now I'm going to introduce you to the canning equipment that we have here today. And I'm going to have to turn around because I have canning equipment behind me as well as on the table. Jars. Canning jars come in all sizes, anywhere from 4 ounces to 128 ounces. Only jars recommended for canning should be used, not mayonnaise jars or jars that you received your pickles in and somebody donated to you, because those jars are manufactured to go through the canning process only once. They are of a thinner material. The bottom of those jars is very, very thin, whereas the bottom of a ball canning jar or a mason jar or any other canning jar is twice the thickness of the wall. And that is so that it can withstand the heat in the bottom of the canner. These canning jars come in a variety of colors and sizes, and the sizes are for different reasons. Quart size is the standard size used for soups and tomato sauces, stewed tomatoes, potatoes, or larger items. The jars also have a different size mouth. Some mouths are wide, and this particular jar is a wide mouth jar. When you open it up, the mouth is wide enough to put a whole pear in there. So if you wanted to do stewed pears or peach halves, this would be the jar you would choose to do that in. The pint jar is a smaller jar and is typically used for smaller families who want to make applesauce and things like that, and pickles, tomato sauce for small families. That's one of the things that these jars are used for. They also come in all shapes and sizes. This jar is called a tapered jar, and the reason it's called tapered is because the bottom of this jar is not as wide as the top of the jar. The reason for that is that this jar can be taken and put into the freezer, and the food can be frozen in it, and it also can be used in a canner. This jar also has a regular mouth. The difference in the regular mouth and the wide mouth you can see. The regular mouth is narrower, and the food items would need to be cut smaller to go in that. Quart jars also come in a regular mouth. And the regular mouth jar has a smaller lid that fits on it. These jars can be decorative, they can be embossed with the logo of the company, they'll have measurements on them, and they even make them now with straight sides and no decorations so that you can see the product clearly that is in the jar, or you can label it and the label will lie flat on the jar. The metal bands and lids. Ball canning jars all come with a lid and a ring. These are used to make the airtight seal on the jar and keep the food shelf stable. Ball recommends that these lids will last 18 months. Previously, the older lids used to last longer. Scientists have found in people's homes, even families have found when grandparents have died, they've gone into the cellar and found jars that have been there for 50 or 60 years. The seal is still intact, the food is still in the jar, and the food is still edible, even though it probably has no nutrition to it. But the seal lasted for that long. And now the newer lids we're being told that 18 months is the life of those. Lids come in 2 varieties. They come metal coated, or they come plastic coated. The metal coated lids, and this part is considered the lid, the flat part. This is the seal of the lid. This is what's considered to last for 18 months. This is a one-time use lid. Once you've used it and you sealed your jar and put it away, and you come back and you open it and take this lid off, this lid is to be tossed. This seal is not good after that point. You can keep them, but not for canning. You can use them to store dry goods in the jar, and you can put the lid on, and you can vacuum seal it that way, but it's not recommended that you can with them the second time. The next type of lid is a plastic lid. The plastic lids are reusable, but they're not recommended by the USDA. There's a few problems with it. They have a solid rubber gasket on it. It doesn't vent very well because it's not flexible. And it lessens the vacuum seal, so the seal doesn't last as long. So your food may be guaranteed instead of 18 months for only 6 months in those because of the seal. I have 4 common reasons that people have found for jar breakage. One is an impact. When you open the box of ball jars, the recommendation is that you wash them in hot soapy water. And once you put them in the sink of water, you must be very careful, because if you have a ceramic sink or if the jars clank together in the sink, they could form a hairline fracture in the glass. If that happens, you won't be able to see it necessarily. You will put your food in it and you'll put the jar in the canner, and then once the canner comes under pressure, the jar comes under pressure in the canner, the jar could break and the glass would shatter and the contents would be spilled. So the recommendation is, when you buy your jars, take off the lids and rings and examine them very carefully. I've bought a brand new pack of jars and had jars broken when I got them. I've also found defects in the jars, like this one has a defect right here, that bubbles are, you can see air bubbles in the glass. Those jars are not safe to can in because those that defect is fragile and could break inside of the canner. Another reason for breakage is putting hot food in cold jars. This causes stress on the jar. And once the jar is stressed and you put it in a canner and you're putting it under more stress, it's likely that the jar will fail. So the best advice that we are given is to heat the jar before you put the food in it. That is very easy to do. You can run water in your sink, and you can fill that sink halfway with water. Lie your jars on their side so that they fill, and then leave them in the hot water until you're ready to put the food in them. The other way to heat your jars is to put a pot of hot water on the stove, and once you've got it boiling, put the jars in there and turn the water off and leave them there until you're ready to fill the jar. Another reason is putting jars directly on the bottom of the canner, and I'll show you in just a moment that each canner comes with a rack, and that rack sits on the bottom, and the glass should sit on top of the rack so that it's not in direct contact with the heat. But if you don't have a rack in your canner, and say you're using a water bath canner, you can take a common kitchen towel and fold it so that it fits in the bottom of your pot, and then sit your glasses on top of the towel. And that will allow you to prevent the jars from touching the bottom of the canner. So the third reason for thermal shock is taking your jars out of the canner and putting them on your cold stone counter or in a cool, drafty place. Both of those methods will cause thermal shock and the glass could break. The third reason for jar breakage is internal pressure. The food in the jar was packed too tightly, or the jars were overfilled with food. Once the food is cooked in the jar, in the canner, when it comes up to heat and the food begins to boil and expand, there's no place for it to go, and the jar will break. The other reason is that the lids were over tightened, and if you remember before, we talked about not tightening the lids too tight because air needs to escape from underneath the lid to allow the vacuum to be created. So there's a way to tighten the lid, and it's called fingertip tightening. What you do is you put the lid on the jar, put the ring on over the lid and begin to tighten it. When you feel it get to the point where you need to tighten it more, you turn it one turn, and that's it. That allows the air to be able to escape, but it does not allow food to come into the jar, and the seal can be created in that manner. The last reason for jar breakage is that the pressure canner themselves can cause jar breakage. The canners are designed that you put 2 to 3 inches of water in the bottom for pressure canner. And if you put that water in and you put your jars in and you don't create a good seal on the lid or you don't lock the lid properly, the water could come out and evaporate and the canner become dry. If the canner should become dry, it can destroy your canner as well as you would lose your food and the jars would break. The jars were placed directly on the bottom can do the same thing. Pressure is reduced too quickly after you process. One of the things that people make a mistake doing when they're pressure canning is they're tired of waiting for the canner to cool down. So instead of waiting, they take the weight off and they let the pressure out themselves. Well, when you do that, you're creating the pressure is being released so fast that the contents of the jar will start to spill out of the jar, or the jar can't handle it at all and it will break in the canner. Another reason is that the pressure fluctuates in the canner because you're turning the heat up and down. Now we are supposed to adjust the heat so that the canner weight just rocks and sits, rocks and sits. But if we adjust it to the point where the canner is not rocking at all, the temperature is too low, then it can cause a problem in processing, and the jars will either break in the canner or they can break once removed from the canner. The other problem with that is that the jars were underprocessed and the food will spoil in the jar. So the last piece of advice for jar breakage is that I want to go over again the fact that we do not use commercially prepared food jars for canning. Make sure that you only use recommended canning jars for canning so that you can avoid breakage and your food will be safe in the jar. Another thing we need to know about the jar is that once we have canned the food and it's in the jar and the jar is cool, we need to check for the seal. And in order to check for the seal, one of the ways you can do it is you can press lightly on the middle of the jar lid. If the jar lid is not sealed, you'll hear this popping sound. If the jar is sealed, you won't hear anything because the lid will be concave and the jar is sealed. Another way to do that is to take a spoon and you want to lightly tap on the top of the lid and it should sound hollow. You hear the difference? If you do not hear that hollow sound, the lid is not sealed and you need to reprocess your canning product. Third way to do it, and I don't do this, but it is a third way to do it, is to take the ring off of the top of the canned product. You should be able to lift it by the lid and the lid not come off. That's a sure way of knowing that your jar is sealed. Now we're going to talk about some basic canning utensils. There's a few things that you really need when canning, and then there are some optional things that are great to have because they are time savers. Now the basic canning kit comes with 4 items. They come with a funnel, a jar lifter. This jar lifter has a magnet on a lid lifter, I'm sorry. This lid lifter has a magnet on the end so that when you have this lid, you don't want to touch it. You want to take the lid lifter and let it pick up the lid and put it on the jar. That's because you've taken these lids and you've washed them in hot soapy water. And once you've gotten them nice and clean and you've laid them out, you want to make sure that you're not touching them and contaminating them anymore. So you use the lid lifter to do that. The next thing that comes in this canning kit is called a bubble remover and a measuring device. Each of these steps is a measurement. And how you measure your food, how you measure your food is called headspace. Every canning recipe will tell you the headspace of the jar. So when you're putting your food in the jar, the recipe will tell you for green beans that it's 1-inch headspace. That headspace is the amount of space of air that's left in the jar that needs to be expressed out during the canning process. So to measure 1 inch of headspace, you would look on your ruler and find the 1-inch mark. And these are very tiny. I doubt if you can see it, but this stair is the 1-inch mark. From this stair to this point is the distance that's how much air will be left in the jar before processing. You're going to take this tool, put it on the edge of your jar. The last step on here should touch the top of the food in the jar. When this touches the top of the food, you've achieved 1-inch headspace. Now the new canning kits do not come with this device anymore. And that's because when the jars were created, they were created with this thread for the ring, for the lid. The bottom thread is at the 1-inch mark. The middle thread is at the 1/2 inch mark. The top thread is at the 1/4 inch mark. So when you have a jelly recipe that says leave 1/4 inch headspace, you can fill your jar to this line and you will have 1/4 inch headspace. The last tool that's in this kit is called a jar lifter. And this is a very, very good tool because it keeps us safe from the hot water involved with canning. When your jar is empty and you have it in a hot pot of boiling water and you're ready to take it out and fill it, you would use the jar lifter, pick the jar up out of the hot water, pour the water back into the canner, and take the jar to a safe surface for filling. Once the jar is full and you want to put it in the canner, you would use the same jar lifters, pick up the jar, bring it over to the pot, place it in the canner, and that keeps you from being scalded by the hot water. The same process for when the lid is open to remove the jars. You would put the lid holder down into the canner, reach for the jar, grasp it, pick it up, take it to a safe environment, and you always want a padded, safe environment for the jar, and rest it there, and that keeps us from being burned. The new sets also come with 2 new items. One is a lid remover. Sometimes I screw these lids on so tight I can't get them off, and this is a handy tool for that. So we would put it on the jar rim, twist, and the lid comes off. The next item that the new kits come with is a set of tongs. Say we're blanching green beans and we want to turn them over or mix them up in the pot, this is a great tool for that. It's also a good tool to pick up the smaller jars. This one you can pick up with the tongs. It doesn't work as well as the jar lifter though. Now when we fill our jars, we want to talk about not just headspace, but also removing air bubbles. The food is inside of the jar, and you can look on the side of the jar and you can see air bubbles all throughout the food, and we need to remove those. And in order to remove those, we use the same tool that we did to measure the headspace. We'd place this tool in the jar, and we'd go around the surface of the food, and we don't have to poke it or anything. We're just going to go around and move the food and allow the air bubbles to rise. Once those air bubbles rise to the top, even if they're floating on the top, that's fine, because during the canning process, the pressure, once the jar begins to boil, is going to force that air out of the jar. It's important to note also that when you're filling your jars, the rim needs to be cleaned before you put the lid on it, or the jar will not seal. So we keep a paper towel and a bowl of water next to our canning station. We would take that paper towel and dip it in the water and wring it out. And then we would wipe the rim of the jar, only the rim. Never let the paper towel go into the jar, because little fibers from the paper towel could drop into your food, and that could be a source of bacteria. So we want to wipe the rim carefully of the jar and before we put the lid on. Just like we need to be clean before we can be sealed. Now we have several different types of canners. We have talked about water bath canning. We have talked about pressure canning, but we've not talked about the pots that you use to do that in. So I'm going to turn around and I'm going to show you a little bit about and tell you a little bit about the canners that we have here. We're going to talk about the water bath canner first. This is the stainless steel version. There are 2 versions. One is enamel and one is stainless steel. The advantage to the stainless steel over the enamel is that this one doesn't rust. The enamel pot will rust over time, but this one will not corrode. Other than that, they are the exact same thing. They are used for high acid foods. They heat up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you remember, high acid foods are fruits, jellies, jams, pickles, and fermented foods. They can all be safely prepared and preserved in a water bath canner. The next canner that I'm going to show you is right down here. And this is a pressure canner. There are 3 different versions of this canner that I'm going to introduce to you. They all have weights that are 15 5 to 15 pounds, but they can be different in different ways. They are either weighted gauge canners or dial gauge canners. This canner is a weighted gauge canner. A weighted gauge canner uses a single weight, 5 pounds, 10 pounds, or 15 pounds, according to your recipe, to put pressure on the jars. These canners have a gasket, and this rubber gasket has to be replaced. It will dry rot over time, and it will need to be replaced. But this gasket helps to form the seal between the lid and the jar. These canners are very easy to close. I have to make sure the gasket is properly in its place. But on the lid of the canner, there's an arrow, and it may be hard for you to see that, but there's an arrow here on the lid of the canner. Also, on the handle of the pot, there's an arrow, and you can see it here. In order to close this canner, those two arrows have to be in the same position or have to be lined up. So we take the canner on the lid and line the arrow on the lid and line it up with the arrow on the handle. And the lid drops down on the canner. Then we take the two handles and we turn them until they close and click. And that is the lock on this canner. Now once the food is in the canner and the canner is locked, it cannot be opened until the pressure comes down completely from the canner. Otherwise, it's likely that the jars in the canner will break or all of the liquid will seep out of the jars because the pressure was removed too quickly. We talked about not putting the jars on the bottom of the canner. These canners each come with a rack or two. Some of them come with two, and they look like this. The jars fit perfectly. In this size canner, you can get 8-quart jars in the bottom and 9 pints. This canner also, when you put jars in, you can double stack. In this jar, you can stack a row of quarts on the bottom and a row of pints on top of that, or 2 rows of pints. And we're going to talk about the next canner. This is the least expensive of all the canners. It's called the Miro Canner, M-I-R-R-O. You can purchase this canner online at Amazon or at Walmart, and it runs $60 to $80 depending on which vendor you purchase it from. Now this canner is the least expensive, but there are reasons why I would not prefer this canner over the others I'll show you. The next canner that we're going to introduce is called the Presto Canner, and we talked about this in our history lesson. The Presto Canner was made by the Presto Company in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and it has a gasket also. There's a rubber gasket in this one, but this one is a weighted gauge canner because it has both a weight and a gauge. It has 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure also. But as I said, it is a gasketed canner. It lines up in the same way as the Miro does to close. You line up the 2 arrows and you twist the handle to close it. Now, what's important about the gauge on this canner that you did not see on the Miro Canner is this gauge tells us how many pounds of pressure the food has on it when you're canning. But the important thing about canning is not the pounds of pressure. It's the temperature that kills the bacteria. What we really want to know is what temperature our food is at. Neither of these canners will tell us that. But they're calibrated to be at 240 pounds of pressure when the 10-pound weight is placed on them. And that's something we have to believe because we have no gauge there to tell us if that is so. The other reason that I don't prefer these 2 canners is the gasket. That rubber gasket, in a time of trouble when we can't buy or sell, has to be replaced, and if we can't get one, we can't use the canner. We're going to talk about our last canner here. And it's the All-American. Now, these 2 canners are spun aluminum, but the All-American is a cast aluminum product. is significantly heavier than the other two. It's built to last a very long time. It's molded out of one piece of aluminum. The advantage to this canner is it has one weight with all three weights on it. It has a metal-to-metal sealing system. In that, the metal on the lid locks into the rim on the canner, creating a complete seal. It does not close the way the other two canners close, although it does have an arrow to line up. And it's hard for me to see it from back here. But once it is lined up, let's see if I can get it lined up. Okay, once it's lined up, the way to lock it is with these wing nuts. You want to bring them up and opposites. So the nut that's opposite the one that you bring up first, that's the one you want to tighten together. And the reason for that is they balance the lid so that air can't leak out. So once you've gotten those two on, you bring up the other two and you tighten those. And you go completely around the canner that way and tighten the wing nuts down. This canner also comes with a rack in the bottom, but if you notice the gauge on this canner, it gives you the pounds of pressure and the temperature. So when I'm watching that needle rise on this canner, I'm knowing I reached 240 degrees, and that's where the botulism spores are killed. I have more confidence in being able to see it than I do in just guessing to know if those weights were calibrated correctly. These gauges will need to be checked over time for their accuracy, and all you have to do is unscrew it or take the lid with you down to your local extension office. They will check the calibration on the gauge for you and recalibrate it if necessary. That should be done once every year. So for me, I steadily rely on the All-American because in the time that we can't buy or sell, there's no gasket for me to buy. I keep extra wing nuts at home, but the wing nuts I don't have to worry about them dry rotting, not so much as a rubber gasket. The other thing I like about the canner, and I prefer about it, is the weight. And because it's a cast product that's made out of one piece of aluminum, and I don't have to worry as much about failure. You know, in the 1940s when canners were being shared by others, one of the problems that they had was that the canners were wearing out and there was no way to replace the parts for them. So that has been a consideration for me in purchasing a canner. And if the All-American is the most expensive out of the three canning products that I have introduced to you, but you don't have to start here. This should be the goal, I think, so that sooner or later you will have the best product that you could possibly have. But start where you can, because the important thing is to start. If you can start with the Miro, start with that. If you can start with the Presto runs between $80 and $100, start with that. These are all between 23 and 25 quarts, and that's what the size canner that the average family would need to use to can for a season. So I would start with a 25 quart or 23 quart and get the best canner I could get and save for a better canner. Now we're going to talk about the steamer juicer. This is one of my favorite canning products. This product is I use this when I'm making jellies and jams, when I want to make juice. And what happens with this is that the bottom pot produces the steam. I fill this with water. The middle pot is our collector. It collects the juice. And the top pot is where we put our food products. This little hose here is used to allow the juice to flow directly into the jar. So you don't have to have a bowl or a pot or anything there. You can put this right into your jar, take the clamp off, which keeps the juice from coming out, and the lid. And as it's steaming, it will fill my jars for me. Now we're going to make mango applesauce in this steamer on our next video. What I would do is cut up my apples. I don't have to peel them. I don't have to core or seed them. I just cut them in quarters and put them directly in the pot. My mangoes I peel and put them directly in the pot and put the lid on and put it on medium-high heat. The water will begin to boil and create a steam which will soften the fruit and bring the juices out. The juice will collect into a jar, and I will take my apples and put them into one of my items, the food mill. Once the apples are dumped inside of the food mill, I will turn the crank of the food mill and applesauce will come out of one end and all of those peels and seeds and stems that I never took out will come out the other. It's a very easy process. I get juice from it and I get applesauce from it. And you know there's a third product I can get from it. If I don't want to jar all of that juice, I can take that and make it into my favorite jam. And now I have juice, I have jam, and I have applesauce from one pot. The advantage to this pot is I can do larger quantities of applesauce at one time. There's very little prep because all I have to do is properly wash my food and cut it up. I get a clear juice because the pulp is kept in the pot for me to use to make applesauce. It's a really fast process. The juice is very concentrated and sweet and delicious and is very easy to use. Now the food strainer that I talked about putting the fruits and vegetables into is a wonderful product also because all I do now is I take that food and I put it in here and I turn the crank or the hopper and the food actually comes down and it's ready to jar from the bowl. So I just take it directly from the bowl and put it into my jar and it's ready for the canner. So this is a very good product. In here you can put apples or tomatoes or you can make baby food. For those of you who are new mothers, these two are priceless. They make your work very easy. Now there's some additional kitchen equipment that you may want to have, and most of us have all of these things in our kitchen already. We have dish towels and drying pads and measuring cups, aprons and hairnets. They're common sense items that everyone has in their kitchen, and they're very easy to use. Now that we've been introduced to all of the equipment that we're going to be using in our next demonstration, the next thing that we will do is make mango applesauce. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you again in the kitchen.